and then it's going to be free form. Everyone else is muted. It'll just be the debaters talking. With those opening statements, you'll get a warning from me at the 1 minute mark. You'll get a warning from me at the 10-second mark. Don't go over the time because you will just find yourself talking to a muted mic. All right. So with that, I'm just going to open up. I guess we can decide who wants to go first, and then we'll crack right into it. So let me just unmute you both. Do you guys have any preference for who goes first? Do you want to flip a coin?
Yeah, I want to go first.
Yeah, I think you should go first.
Okay, so whenever you start, I will start the timer. You'll get a warning at 1 minute and 10 seconds.
Okay. It might not take that long, so I might just cede the rest of my time to JF in that occurrence. I'm also out and about, so whatever that's worth of it. Okay, so the labor theory of value is a theory that there are theories of value dating to antiquity from Aristotle to Adam Smith and then onwards, that was expanded upon by Marx. I think that Marx introduced the concept of surplus value and exploitation, and that's what kind of generated a bunch of predictions from the original theory. So I don't intend to defend the logical coherence of the labor theory of value during this discussion. I more intend to explain the empirical implications of the theory and then suggest that they've been borne out by common examples that we all sort of understand. There already exist common observations that we would agree. I think that JF would agree that fall out as a logical consequence of the theory, and given that they fall out as a logical consequence of the theory, they therefore are taken to be confirmations of the theory, and they are consequences that the theory was not originally intended to explain, right? So we'll start with that. What the theory was intended to explain was the prices that commodities would trade at. There was when supply and demand would fluctuate, but they would always fluctuate around a particular price. And so that price is what we're calling the equilibrium price. And so roughly the theory is to explain why commodities that trade at those prices do so rather than some other price. This is a theory, by the way, I posit that no neoclassical economic theory has endeavored to explain or can explain, for that matter. It doesn't make that prediction. Now, the reason that the labor theory of value makes that prediction is because it's just sort of positive. If the value is positive as a theoretical, unobservable, that you can engage in a progressive resource program with respect to, and it's conferred by the amount of socially necessary labor time it takes to reproduce a commodity at a given time and place. And so you can see why things that are reproducible goods, that even if you had equal amounts of what Marx calls constant capital and variable capital, might trade at different rates for, and that's because of the labor time expended on those commodities. So, say you had the same production goods, the same cost of production goods and the same cost of wages for two commodities, but one commodity took an hour to produce and another commodity took, well, I don't know, let's say 30 minutes to produce. You'd expect on the labor theory of value that when supply and demand were at equilibrium, for both of those commodities. The commodity that took an hour to produce would be at a higher price than the commodity that took 30 minutes to produce, barring monopoly conditions and other restrictive conditions. But this is what this is what value is.
I stopped the timer for a second. You are not audible. This is what value is on. Okay, I've restarted.
This is what. Sorry, I was pressing the thing. This is what value is on the theory. It's the a theoretical, unobservable, intrinsic to the commodity that's conferred by the labor time that was taken to produce the commodity under certain conditions. And so what this theory does then is it generates a bunch of logical consequences. Right now, there are a few more definitions I have to get through. One thing is how profit is defined on the theory. Profit is the difference between the surplus value, which is produced by the laborer, and the variable capital and the constant capital. So it takes the formulation S is equal to the value minus the constant capital plus the variable capital, and we can get into one of those terms later if we're end up discussing that theory. But as a result of this, we have a few predictions. Given capitalism is a mode of production that aims to maximize the profit of commodity producers, and there's all sorts of hedging and things that needs to be done there, but I can save that for later. So the basic overview is things that are predicted on Marx's economic theory, and I'll explain how each of these is predicted. And some might occur to me as I'm explaining, because like I said, I'm walking around, I don't have anything planned. But one thing is pressure to increase in technological advancements and increases in technological advancements, contentions between the working class and the capitalist class on the duration and intensity of the working day. Let's see, the relative impoverishment of the working class, the rate of the decline in the rate of profit over long wave periods of expansion, and the long wave periods of expansion is relevant there because the rate of profit actually increases during periods of depression, according to the theory. And let's see, can't think of any other predictions off the top of my head. There's a ton of predictions. I could probably get probably 11 predictions. I might be able to give a resource for if JF later decides, but I'll explain kind of sort of the ones that I already outlined and how they're a logical consequence of the theory. So if profit really is this difference that we've talked about, the difference in surplus value, and the value of a commodity is the combination of these three things, which is the constant capital, the variable capital, and the surplus value. And we if that's the value, then the only way to get surplus value, which is what I'm saying is profit, well, a portion of the surplus value is profit, and that's because certain amounts of funds have to be allocated towards the unproductive sector, other things that are necessary besides other capitalists are going to require things like landowners are going to require things like rent payment and stuff like that. So that doesn't come out of the constant capital, nor does it come out of the variable capital. The variable capital is just the wages paid. Well, for our purposes, it's just the wages. For simplistic analysis, it's just the wages. Those don't come out of, they come out of the surplus value. So in a sense, other capitalists are demanding some of the value. So the profit is what's left over that the capitalist has after paying off the other capitalists for things like rents and security and other things like that. Things that are unproductive labor, but are not necessarily part of the production process. And so, if that's really what profit is on Marxist theory, and capitalism is a mode of production that seeks to maximize profit, then there are a few things that can be done. So, one thing that can be done is there can be improvements in technology that limit the amount of variable capital that it takes to produce a commodity. So the idea there is that if you replace a worker with a machine, there's obviously some initial investment with the machine, but eventually it's going to cost less to operate the machine than it will be to pay the worker. That's why you see those advancements. And before that's generalized in an economy, the socially necessary labor time hasn't really decreased, or if it hasn't decreased, it hasn't decreased by much, given that productive sector of capital. So while you can still sell the commodity at market price before that technology is generally adopted. So in doing that, you're going to increase market share. There are a few things that come as a consequence of this that I already talked about. In doing that, you'll be able to increase your market share because you'll be able to sell close to market value but below market value, so it would be a better deal than, consumers are going to obviously be incentivized to purchase the better deal. So you're going to be able to sell the goods at close to market value, and you'll pay less for variable capital. That is to say, you'll pay less for the wages specifically for producing that commodity. And so if profit is just the difference between the surplus value produced, which you're still getting, right, and the constant capital, the variable capital, well, if you decrease the variable capital, then obviously you'll be able to sell at market price because the technology has not been generally adopted, so the value is still high. And given that you can sell at market price, or at or below, close to market price, you can generate super profits. Now, given that you can generate super profits, capitalists can take these investments and reinvest them towards things like improving technological advances, which creates a cycle, and also invest in buying out other capitalists and things like that. So, there's a few things you would expect from that. Once the technology is generally adopted, then what you end up expecting is the rate of profit decreases, and the rate of profit is something distinct from profit itself. The rate of profit is the surplus value, the ratio of surplus value to the constant capital plus variable capital. Now, so given that you expect, this is during periods of expansion. Let me see if I can refocus for a minute. So that's one thing it actually predicts is a pressure on technological advancement. There's no explanation on marginal utility theories or other neoclassical economical theories that explains why we should expect growing technological advancement. But it is predicted on Marx's analysis because that's the only way that you can that's the only way that you can gain. Well, that's a way to gain super profits under capitalism, right? So another thing falls out from that, right, which is that as workers are generally replaced by machines, this exerts a downward pressure on them engaging in the productive sector. because
1 minute.
oh no, because after that there's a reserve. There's what's called the reserve army of the unemployed, people who are unemployed. And so what that means is that workers who were not previously in that area of the productive sector can now be incorporated into that productive sector because they need jobs. So they're willing to take lower wages given that they were in some other productive sector. So that's another prediction borne out by the theory. And then there's also things like the conflict between the duration of the working day, which you can see it falls out just because if you get workers to work longer, then you make more profit. And also if you improve the intensity, then you improve the productive output, and you're essentially decreasing the variable capital. So that's why I think the labor theory of value entails all of those things, and I think the empirics bear that out.
That's time. Okay, so I'm just going to mute Josh, pass it to JF. You have up to 15 minutes. Use as much or as little of it as you want, and then we'll go into freeform discussion.
All right. Thank you. Ask yourself. Do you guys hear me on the Discord? I'm not sure I've set my audio properly. I think you do.
Clear.
All right. So
the timer will start whenever you start.
All right. So what we have here is a presentation of the labor theory of value, which I believe is true in some way. It's true like a truism, and it's not even wrong in some way. The statement that labor has something to do with price makes no doubt. Labor is a cost in the production of goods, and to the extent that some goods do require labor, they will respect momentarily, or they will be influenced by labor to the extent that labor is a cost. My point with the labor theory of value is simply to say, my expression that I just did in the last 30 seconds, that is all that the labor theory of value is. And what our friend here has presented to us is nothing else than a statement that labor is one of the costs that capitalists do have to pay to produce stuff and sell it on the market. That's a truism to the extent that it doesn't give us particular insight. It doesn't even explain many goods. For example, prostitution. In prostitution, you have certain prostitutes who are extremely beautiful, and they can charge much, much more for the same labor. And so you can see already a problem with defining value around labor time. It's that not all labors are worth the same. Not all prostitutes are capable of charging $500 for a blowjob. Some prostitutes, their blowjobs is worth nothing, literally. Some of them, they may be worth $10, $30. Some of them may be able to charge thousands of dollars because they are extremely beautiful. They can therefore suck the dick of richer men who can afford it. So you have here one example, and there are thousands of examples. Academic Agent was raising the problem of shirts, jerseys from a particular university or a certain sports team. They are definitely not defined by the value of the labor. They obey laws that relate to identity, to just how much value people put in a trademark, to the fact that these trademarks are copyrighted and that other people are not able to produce. So already with the labor theory of value as it is claimed and laid out in front of us, we have an extremely limited insight into the mechanisms of market value. It really is telling us just a part of the goods that we are interested in, and it's those goods that would be mass-produced, potentially produced by other companies, and of which most of the cost, most of the value on the market is actually due to the cost of production, which in turn is due to the cost of labor. That is just a part of the goods of the market. To that extent, the labor theory of value is extremely limited in the insight that it gives you on human exchanges. That is one thing. So I prefer a theory that encompasses labor time as one of the costs, and that can also explain other things. Such theories exist, theories based on demand and offer. Once you understand that labor is just one of the factors, one of the costs in generating an offer, then you understand that the labor theory doesn't tell you anything else that the neoclassicism would tell you. It simply puts an unjustified focus on labor as a cost. But in fact, it's not always the case even that labor is a cost in the production of goods. I've named a couple of them that where labor is really unimportant. We can think also of stuff like Bitcoin that gain in value, not necessarily according to tendencies and the labor deployed to it. The value of Bitcoin is largely independent of the amount of computation labor that is put into it. It is mostly due to speculative forces, to availability of US dollars, to perceived differences. So this perceived differences in the value of things explains much more the variations on the market that we observe for many other goods. And in fact, it can incorporate whatever has been said here about the labor theory of value. You can say, well, the capitalist approaches the world. He has some capital and he perceives the potential output of his workers as being more valuable than what they demand. That's where profit emerges. If that is what the labor theory of value is, I agree with it, but I just think it's not even worth putting into a full theory of value. I think it's just worth saying that yes, costs exist. That is the extent I agree with it. The extent to which I disagree with it is when these people, and I believe that our colleague here today is stating this, those people who believe that the labor theory of value predicts an unsustainability of capitalism. And they follow a logical path, but a logical path that is unfortunately incomplete. We had a glimpse of this in what has just been said. Essentially, the profits can momentarily be converted into super profits. So due to the advances of technology, one of the consequences that we have is that technology gets generally adopted, rate of profits decrease on pressure, and there's a pressure on technological advancement. My debate partner here has been suggesting that neoclassicism doesn't explain technological advancement. Well, of course it does. If you understand all of the dynamics between the capitalist, his company, the profits that he wants to derive, the buyers, the employees, and you understand that the employees are replaceable units, essentially, where the owner of the system can say, well, I can reduce my cost and produce the same amount of things so that I can answer to the demand of the market. Well, therefore, it makes sense for a capitalist to be buying new technologies. Not only is it good for the capitalist itself, it is good for the entirety of society if he's right about his call. If he's right about his call, we're going to have more cell phones or more whatever it is that he produces. And these things will come at a lower cost since the combined spending of the potential demanders of this product will be less since they will have to reimburse less workers. So it is absolutely false that the labor theory of value is the only one that can sustain, that can explain technological advancement. Technological advancement make total sense under a neoclassicist view. Then we are presented with the theory that, okay, reserve army of the unemployed needing jobs, so they will be willing to be taking cheaper paid jobs, and that this is one of the elements that will lead to the unsustainability of capitalism as it is created. First, I want to think about what is value, and I'm going to ask after my introduction, how do we define value? Because the part of Marx and the part of the labor theory of value in general that states that value is determined by labor time is not so much a factual statement. And I've heard earlier, if we can determine that profit really is surplus value or is a part of surplus value, you really can't. You really can't determine that profit is surplus value because these constructs are really human constructs, and I would even argue moral constructs. When you say that profit is surplus value, you are saying surplus to something that I would define as being the threshold value. You're saying that really all of the legitimate expenses were the production of labor, and that this profit is somehow unjust or it creates instability, or in a perfect society it should be removed. I oppose to this kind of view because this kind of view does not properly reward capitalists for their innovative allocation of funds. The way I see modern society, and the reason I think ultimately that capitalism is not threatened by the considerations of the labor theory of value, is that capitalists must be rewarded for putting their money in the right place. It is absolutely undeniable that you can put billions of dollars in an absolutely useless endeavor. Elon Musk sometimes makes me think about this. I mean, most of the time he proves me wrong because Tesla was not doing so great economically. Eventually, he diluted his wealth in space exploration and car advancement and engineering of underground tunnels. And to some extent, sometimes he makes me believe that he may pull it off. But at the same time, I can't deny that much of these projects will probably go to waste, or they will be forgotten, or he's not going to be able to develop a product that is sellable. Now, I want a society where the capitalist is rewarded for making the good cause in the allocation of capitalist resources. In other words, money, as far as we're concerned, but it could go beyond money. But as far as our society is concerned, the capitalists are essentially allocating money to projects. And there is this beautiful hidden structure in capitalism, which is that, as it turns out, capitalism rewards with more money those managers that can make the right decisions about their money, about where to invest human energy. And of course, the labor workforce is untalented to make that kind of decision. Most people are not intelligent enough to know. In fact, most politicians even are not. That's why the state is so incompetent. But in general, the workforce has not demonstrated a particular skill at putting money in the right place. That's why co-ops are ultimately doomed to be drained out of the selfish and unintelligent desires of their members. It is that a co-op that becomes big enough will not have a proper strategy for allocation of resources because it has no way to reward proper allocation of resources. In capitalism, this reward is profit. And unlike the Marxists who call it surplus value, essentially whispering in our ears that it's illegitimate value or non-value, I say, no, it is a proper mechanism. That's why capitalistic society went further than socialist societies. They developed more because there was this this intrinsic reward mechanism for good resource allocators. Now, what is being suggested by the labor theory of value is that essentially, because of the reserve army of the unemployed who are infinitely willing to work for less and work for less, and the capitalists who are infinitely willing to get more and more profits, there is no end to this system. It ends with essentially super billionaires exploiting in some savage ways the unemployed or worker class that is willing to work for pennies. And I will say on this, it is, when you look at the concentration of wealth, there is definitely a tendency for concentration of wealth. But what Marx has forgotten is that this was not the only mechanism. There are other mechanisms that Marx didn't focus on, or that I at least haven't heard here in this debate, and it is the mechanism for the dilution of wealth of the rich, which exists. And because they exist, this paranoid expectation that capitalism will fail because of this infinite projection into the future is actually wrong. What's happening is that billionaires have wealth, but only in fictive representations of wealth, which we call dollars. A dollar really doesn't mean anything unless someone is willing to work for it. And so by this fact, by the fact that the wealth of the great riches of our world is fictional and representative, it is either paper or digital money, the only way that a billionaire can really
1 minute
all right. The only way that a billionaire can really act into the world is by getting rid of some of that wealth, by paying out some projects, and some of them will not work. And eventually the wealth will be diluted, as we often see, vast amounts of wealth getting diluted, at least if not within the generation they've been acquired, within a few generations. I will finish by saying that this supposed detection of an inconsistency in capitalism that leads to its destruction is not what will lead to the destruction of capitalism. What's leading to the destruction of capitalism is the ever-growing appropriation of private property by a democratic mob through the violent actions of the state. That is what destroys capitalism, and it's happening right now, and it's going to keep happening, but not through the mechanism that are proposed by my debater here.
Okay, so at this point, both parties have used up their intro statements, so we're just going to move into free form. You guys aren't going to hear from me at all unless there's some kind of technical issue. And you can make it as respectful or not respectful as you want because of that. So, that's kind of on you guys. And I'll just additionally say that if you want to do Q&A, we didn't discuss this, but if you guys decide on that, just let me know and we can move into Q&A and there'll be various people who have questions. So, with that, take.
Yeah, so I don't actually. So a large part of your criticism wasn't actually. In fact, I would venture to say all of your criticism wasn't actually a criticism of the labor theory of value. One thing that you pointed to that was just that you have another theory that maybe explains a technological innovation, right? That was, you said that could be explained elsewhere, right? But that's not the only explanatory virtue we look for when we look for explaining phenomena. I mean, I could just grant that, although I don't, in fact, grant that, and I'm very speculative that you actually drew the logical inference from what you said about neoclassical economics. And I think there's actually like an implicit concession to the labor theory of value in what you said, but that's neither here nor there. One of the criticisms that you said that doesn't make any sense, so we could just start with point one. You pointed to a non-commodity, right, which was prostitution. And the labor theory of value stipulates that value only exists is only produced by commodity production. So pointing out prostitutes is just not a criticism of the theory.
So are haircutting services, are they a commodity?
I don't know. I don't think so, because there's not like a, I mean, there might be, I'm not sure, but there might be, I don't think that there's a freely reproducible good there, right? The freely,
then you recognize that most of the economy is actually not described by the labor theory of value.
Well,
because we're a service economy.
I don't know what that, hold on a sec. I want to stop there. So I don't think it follows that because the value that's produced in the productive sector is used in other sectors of capital, that therefore it doesn't have its origin in the productive sector. I don't agree with that, right? So I don't think that you've supported that inference, right? It might be the case that the productive sector is very, very small, but that all of the value in the economy is produced in that productive sector, and in fact distribute it to the rest of the economy, which might be much larger. So you'd have to explain why you think it doesn't come from the productive sector.
Well, all I'm pointing out right now is my first point, which was the limits of the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value is essentially saying, I found an explanation for the value of certain goods, only those goods that are produced by labor only, and in fact, not even hair cutting services. I'm just pointing out that most of our economy is actually a service economy in Western civilization.
Yeah, but I have to ask again, how is that relevant? I mean, I don't necessarily agree with you. I don't actually know, but I have to ask how that's relevant. How would that be a relevant criticism to the theory? Like that type of criticism is just a type of criticism that says, well, you have a theory that doesn't explain everything, therefore it's not a good theory. It's obviously irrational.
Well, whenever someone comes with a theory, we should definitely determine the domain of application of this theory. What I'm telling you here is that you have a theory that makes huge claims about capitalism will be unsustainable, and apparently it can't even describe most of capitalism. It describes only a part of the...
When you say it can't describe it, I haven't granted you that, right? I'm granting that there are non-productive sectors in the economy. That's as much as I've granted you. But you're tasked with, you made the positive claim that the value that's traded in those productive sectors in those unproductive sectors doesn't come from the productive sector. And you haven't justified that claim.
Well, certainly it is. I've not said that it didn't come from the non-productive sector or the productive sector. I've said that it was not explained by the labor theory of value. So prostitutes, haircutting, jersey t-shirts from sports team, university t-shirts, what have you. I mean, this is most of the economy that has not been explained by the labor theory of value, which on the other end says, I predict that capitalism will fail 200 years from now or 1,000 years from now. I don't know when.
Wait, but let's set aside the predictions, because I haven't made any specific claims about when the capitalist economy will fail or anything, right?
No, but do you claim that it will fail? Even if you don't claim when, do you claim it will fail?
I believe it will fail, but I'm not.
You believe that based on the labor theory of value, right? So it's a prediction of the labor theory of value.
Well, let me explain. Well, why don't we just deal with before we get to that? Why don't we just deal with the criticisms that you've levied so far, right? Because they're not a criticism of the labor theory of value to just point out that it doesn't explain things it's not designed to explain, right? And there's a ton of things that it was not designed to explain, yet it explains, yet it predictions that fall out of the theory. Those were some of the ones that I listed previously, right? Which is the inherent conflict between the length and intensity of the working day. Also, technological advancement, which you have just, like your criticism there, is just that there are other things that explain it, right? But that's not a sufficient rebuttal. And then
it's certainly a rebuttal of your point. Your point was there is no other theory that has ever explained technological advancement. You said that, and it's wrong.
I said that it doesn't fall out as a logical consequence of any other theory. Now, I explained how it falls out as a logical consequence of the labor theory of value, right? That and I haven't heard any criticism of that explanation, right? So whether or not it could be hypothetically explained, or I made a wrong claim about what other system does, is irrelevant to criticizing the labor theory of value, right? Because the point of the labor theory of value is that it explains the phenomenon that's observed, right? And so it counts in favor of the theory, regardless of whether or not it also counts in favor of another theory, which I'm claiming it doesn't. But it still counts in favor of the labor theory of value, whether or not it counts in favor of another theory, right?
Well, the thing is, I'm not going to debunk the parts of the labor theory I agree with. If I agree that cost influence the price of something, of course, I will agree to the extent that this part of the theory makes prediction. Of course, no one needed that theory to conclude that the price would be influenced by labor value, because in the end, if there's any money you have to spend on the production of something, it will be reflected in the final price. That part is true, so I won't debunk this. I don't know why you expect this. What I'm pointing out is the limited domain of application of this theory does not allow you to make claims about the entirety of society and the sustainability of capitalism itself.
Well, again, I mean, look, the whole point is, if I don't know what you're doing. If you're agreeing with the labor theory of value, then I'm not sure exactly what this debate is, right? I'm just trying to get clear on the predictions that it makes that you think it hasn't have not been observed. That is to say, those observations falsify or disconfirm the theory. That's what I want to know.
Well, here's one prediction that has never been observed, that a capitalist society, because of the greater profits given to the capitalists, that eventually it will crumble and fall and be unsustainable.
Now, whether or not, look, that's not, again, there's no specific time limit on that. And it might not even be, I mean, I think that, but it's not clear that you've derived that as a logical consequence of the theory. I happen to think it is. I'm not, but all of the ones that I have derived, the predictions that I have derived, they are falsifiable. And you haven't pointed out how any single one of those has not been observed, right? Now, one thing, there are a few things that I pointed out, right? Like, the one thing is the inherent tension between the capitalists and the workers about the length and duration of the working day. Now, on the labor theory of value, we can explain that because what profit is on the labor theory of value is surplus value produced. So the longer your workers work, the more value, the more surplus value that is produced, right? And the harder your workers work, the more surplus value is produced, right? So I can explain that on the labor theory of value. I can explain why there would be an inherent tension there. That's one thing that you haven't.
The thing is, you can see that tension. I believe you are wrong in your prediction, and Marx was wrong in predicting that, therefore, the conditions of life of the bottom of society would worsen with time. In fact, the conditions of life of the bottom of society have improved every 100 years forever since capitalism exists.
All right, so let's stop there. Let's figure out how you derive that, or that Marx claimed. I mean, maybe we don't have to get into the empirical discussion, but explain to me how you think that it falls out of the labor theory of value.
Well, you said that the reserve army of the unemployed need jobs, so they are willing to take cheaper paid jobs. The fact is that today, independent of the price of the job or the hourly rate, today someone at the bottom of society has a better life than 100 years ago someone at the bottom of society.
What does it have to do with, what does that have to do? It wasn't making predictions about the quality of people's lives, right?
Okay, so you recognize that under capitalism, there is not an ever-growing threat to the bottom of society as they accumulate less and less wealth and therefore are reduced to states of slavery. You don't.
Look, I mean, the whole point there is that I didn't say that anybody would be reduced to slavery. It just seems like you don't know anything about Marx, right? The whole point is that
slave society. But you said that the reserve army of the unemployed.
No. Let me explain why what you said doesn't make any sense. Okay, so what you said was that we're reduced to slave society, but in a Marxist analysis, slave societies progress to feudal societies, and feudal societies progress to capitalist societies. So there's no reduction to slavery. So that doesn't make any sense, right? The point is that there's a relative to the distribution. I mean, there are a lot of caveats, right? Because, like, if you think about the wealth inequality globally, there's a lot of cases in which, I mean, like you see the ads on TV or whatever, like 1,000, that there are productive sectors, the global productive sector, in a lot of places where capitalists have a lot of control. Their standards of living have decreased, but it is true that the standards of living has increased, and that's because there's an appropriation of value across different sectors of capital, right? So the whole thing is like you can't take the immiseration non-relativistically. You have to take it relativistically, and if you take it relativistically, you do predict a widening wealth gap, and a widening wealth gap is what you see.
That's very interesting. So you're one of the few communists who recognize that the bottom gets richer with capitalism. You are saying the only wealth gap that is developing is relative. So the billionaires are just getting richer faster than me. But as a member of the bottom of society, I'm actually getting better on an every decade basis. That's what you're
I mean, I haven't granted that, but the whole point is that what falls out of the theory is
by abandoning the absolute for the relative, you grant.
Sorry, what's that?
By abandoning the absolute argument for the relative wealth gap, you are granting this. You're saying it's only in the relative wealth. As everyone is progressing forward, societies are getting richer in general. Even the bottom is getting richer, but you're not satisfied by how fast they are getting rich with respect to the billionaire.
I'm not talking about, look, none of this has to do with my satisfaction or whatever, right? It has nothing to do with that. So I would appreciate it if you would just stay on topic. The whole point is that's predicted on the theory. The relative immiseration of the proletariat is predicted on the theory. And so given that we see that, that's confirmation of the theory.
Not necessarily. One observation is simply confirmation of a compatibility with the theory. That being said, it is not a proof that the theory is right. And in fact, I've demonstrated that if it is right in such a restricted domain of the economy that it's uninteresting for statements at the global society level.
Again, you haven't explained that, right? Like you've just said.
I have.
I said that I agreed with you that there's a non-productive sector. Now, I haven't agreed with you about the dominion of the unproductive sector, and you haven't explained the dominion. You haven't given statistics of the dominion of the unproductive sector. But regardless of that fact,
haircutting services were not included in your theory. Prostitution, essentially anything that does not lead to a little thing that you can buy between $1 and $100 seems like it gets out of your.
I understand, but I don't know why you cut me off right there, because the whole point is that the unproductive.
I cut you off because you affirmed that I haven't said something that I've said, and I will keep cutting you off as long as you do.
No. What you haven't. Look, I didn't say you said anything. I said you haven't shorn up the view, which, I mean, is not relevant. I'm just pointing out that what you didn't do, which is you haven't shown that the unproductive sector is far greater than the productive sector, or how that's measured, or any of that. Like, you haven't done that, right? That's what I said you haven't done. So, but that's ultimately irrelevant, right? Because let's say, for example, that the labor theory of value doesn't explain the unproductive sector. It doesn't. I mean, I do think it would predict an unproductive sector. I think it falls.
By the way, the fact that you're referring to haircut specialists as unproductive is absolutely ludicrous. It shows the ridiculousness of your theory.
Now you don't understand the theory. Because if you think it's ludicrous, then you're just not. Then you are simply not engaging the theory.
Because it's a service, it's not.
Yeah, services are not products.
Oh my God, that is more than 90% of the current economy.
Well, that's another claim. That's another claim that you haven't justified, right? But whether or not I grant that claim, I could grant that it's 90% of the economy is productive. That's irrelevant to the fact that the labor theory of value. Maybe it doesn't predict that there will be an unproductive sector or whatever, but that's just saying that the labor theory of value doesn't predict things it's not designed to predict, which doesn't count against the theory. Like nothing you're saying counts. Like it just seems like you're objecting with things that don't. It's like saying, well, look, the precession of Mercury doesn't predict whether or not I will get a haircut. Therefore, the theory of gravity is false. I mean, that's a ridiculous.
You've been framing a strawman for a while, so I will cut it out right now. You are saying that I have to come here and debunk the labor theory of value. My statement, which you criticize, is not the labor theory of value is false in all cases and labor costs don't matter to anything. My statement is your theory as a restricted domain of application in the entirety of our economies. That was my statement. And there you are saying, you don't debunk me, you don't debunk me. I just told you, you have a restricted reach of explanation for your theory, which is ridiculously low. That's all I'm saying.
Well, again, you haven't actually explained that. You've made the claim. You haven't pointed out how just because there's an unproductive sector that trades value, that there's something wrong with the theory, because on the theory they would get that value from the productive sector, right? So I don't understand.
I've not said there was something wrong with the theory as far as its statement on labor cost. I agree that labors are a cost. And they will be more important to sectors of the economy in which it takes a lot of labor and where the cost of labor represents a higher percentage of the final product. Where I disagree finally with the theory is in the prediction that capitalism therefore is unsustainable. We have many clues that in fact capitalistic society are more sustainable than other societies that are centrally planned, socialism, communism, and things of the kind. So this particular prediction, which you told me in private before this debate, was your position. You haven't made a case for it. How do we get here? How do we get from your theory that cost of labor matter to therefore societies will crumble under capitalism?
Well, I mean, I can talk about the decline of the rate of profit over long wave periods of expansion. Which also explains the relative administration of the proletariat, which is something I've already talked about, right? And then, like the whole, I mean, I guess I don't really understand what you don't understand, right? Like when there's a period of expansion and you're investing more, like if the theory is true and you're investing more and more resources into labor-saving technology and the acquisition of competing firms, which is also what I'm also predicted on the theory, is that the tendency of capital to concentrate, which I didn't mention earlier, but it also points it confirms the theory. What I don't understand is that you're saying that. And the widening wealth inequality and the widening, relative wealth inequality, and also the dissension amongst the workers and the capitalists about the length and duration of the working day. I don't know when exactly it will overthrow capitalism, right? I mean, there are a few options. The options is that we end up reduced to barbarism, so capitalist property relations are overthrown because there was some sort of violence that led to the descent of the human species or something like that. Or we figure out how to produce a socialist economy. But like saying something, so the inference is there, right? The inference is just that you can't continually, when you depend on a labor force to continually produce goods, and the labor force, because of the growing tensions which are observed, will no longer continue to produce or whatever. That just seems like that's a fallout of the theory. If it gets to a point that workers refuse to produce because they want a revolution or because they engage in violence against the capitalist class, and that results in barbarism. It's like, I mean, whether or not I don't now. I'm not confident that that's. I believe that that'll come out of the theory. I mean, I believe that it'll either be reduced to socialism or barbarism. But whether I mean, I don't have a specific time frame for that, and I don't think anybody has a specific time frame for that. But whether or not it predicts the movements of the capitalist economy, which you haven't contested at all, is a completely separate question. You know, now I think I've been giving arguments to the effect that it predicts the movements of the capitalist system, right? It predicts many of the things that I've talked about. It predicts the relative amelioration of the proletariat. It predicts the tendency of capital to concentrate. It predicts the tendency of the rate of profit to fall during long wave periods of expansion. It predicts the conflict, the inherent conflict between the length and intensity of the working day between capitalists and the working class. I mean, and it doesn't seem like any of those things are objectionable to you. And if those are all a logical consequence of the theory, then it seems like what you should do, given that that theory predicts all those things, is accept the theory. Unless you're saying that those predictions are false, or you show that there's a prediction that's made that is actually false, right? That of those three, those are concrete predictions. Or those are predictions that we have. That's not just my opinion. That's not a sociological question. My sociological opinion is irrelevant to the theory, right?
Well, it is relevant because you believe that it is the outcome of this theory to predict the crumbling of capitalist society. And it is based on a logical fallacy. And it's not because a theory would be right about some things that it is right about everything. The fallacy that you're making, the fallacy that you're making is to think that because there's a conflict, the system must crash. Conflicts can exist within systems that can survive. The conflict between the working class and the capitalist class is subject to ever-going negotiations when it's in the form of a union or a certain denial of work, like striking or like just giving up your job, and the capitalist finds himself forced to hire someone else and maybe to offer a better price. Those tensions are not grounds for believing that the system is untenable. And in fact, what we observed is that in capitalist society, the work hours are actually better negotiated than in socialist society. Right now, the work hour in many socialist countries is greater than in the US, a fully capitalist system.
There's no such thing as a socialist country, right? Like this doesn't make any sense. Given the theory.
If you don't like the label, then call them centrally planned countries. Like,
all right. Well, I'm not defending China. I'm defending the labor theory of value. So I don't know what the point of your criticism is, right? Because the whole point is that if you think there's a prediction that comes out of now, I haven't predicted this is. I've been very careful about what I claim the theory predicts, right? Now. And the difference between what the theory predicts and my sociological opinion, I've made that very clear, right? My sociological opinion is that capitalism will fail. Now that's not. Now I believe that because of the rising tensions of the capitalist class and the working class, and whatever. But that's not a prediction made by the labor theory.
You are trying. I must stop you here because You're trying to lie to the audience. Let me read a DM that was sent by you before the debate begins. You say, the LTV is a theory of capitalist economies which shows that capitalist economies are ultimately unsustainable.
Yeah, that's right.
That was your definition of the labor theory of value, and here you are saying, no, it's just my opinion, dude. No, you claimed to me before this debate that this was the outcome of your theory, and here you are deceiving the audience to make them think that it's just a personal opinion, bro.
Well, no, I made it very clear what I think that the labor theory of value predicts. And I've separated my sociological opinion. I agree that I said whatever I said for brevity's sake to discuss this with you in DM, right? Like, I'm not. All right,
so you're like Hillary Clinton. You have a private and a public position.
No,
Ask yourself, I'm going to be ready soon to be headed toward the concluding step.
No. I'm not saying that there's some like private or public opinion or whatever, I would readily tell anybody that it's not immediately obvious to me how it'll collapse the capitalist system. But what is immediately obvious is the set of predictions that I've laid out about the theory, which, I mean, I don't know, it doesn't sound like you actually object to, so it doesn't actually sound like you reject the labor theory of value. Maybe you accept the labor theory of value and come to a different sociological conclusion than I do. Maybe you think that the labor theory of value adequately explains the laws of motion of the capitalist system, and nevertheless disagree that it implies that capitalism will fail. That might be fine, but insofar as the predictions that I've laid out in discussing the theory, you haven't addressed a single one of them.
I'm just going to come in for a sec. So I did say I'd only come in for technical reasons, but I should have also said, or at the behest of the debaters. So I've heard a request from JF to move into closing. Is that what we want to do here? Are both parties kind of wanting to move to closing statements?
I'm fine to closing soon, yes.
Yeah, I'm fine.
All right, so maybe I can do my closing statement first. What we have here is someone who makes grandiose claims about the inevitability of the capitalistic crash, which does not happen, which has actually happened in the kind of centrally planned economy that Marx wanted. Okay, do you hear me now?
Yes, I do. Sorry about that.
All right, so we can be headed toward the concluding statements. I'm back. So what we have here is a person who makes grandiose claims based on a very simple truism that cost of labor matter in the product. Of course. And that, yeah, of course, because cost of labor matter, technological advancement will happen so as to reduce the cost of labor. This would be predicted by a million different theories, including the ones running into the child's brain when they're in elementary school. That is not the proof that a theory is true. It is simply the proof that the theory is not wrong enough to badly predict the obvious. So that is what I see in the labor theory of value. On the one hand, a very basic statement, a truism about cost. Okay. But then a paranoid extrapolation into the future of mechanisms that haven't been shown to occur in reality and that are complemented by counterbalancing mechanisms that are ignored by Marx and ignored by his followers, like we've heard today. So in the end, we find ourselves with the biggest and grandiose prediction of these people, the crash of capitalism being unobservable, and we don't know when it will happen, but it will. Essentially, we are faced with a moral theory that tells humanity we should go that way. We should try to undermine capitalism, which of course it might be one of these predictions that end up being true, these self-fulfilling prophecies. Because if the people like my debater colleague here succeed at convincing enough people to appropriate the means of production, they will effectively make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. But it won't be by the mechanism that are suggested here. The friction between the work hours of the working class and the capitalists have led to nothing else than advances in our society, advances in the way people negotiate, people use unions to appropriate a little more of the value of their work. And that's fine. But those are the mechanisms that make capitalism, in fact, an extremely sustainable system, because there are ways where workers, if they are unsatisfied with what they have, that they can collectivize and ask for more. I don't see here the link to the final prediction, the most important one, the only one that matters, because the rest of the prediction, predicting that there would be technological advancement, you could reach that with a million different theories. Those are my closing statements.
Well, we actually, because Josh had the first word, we do want to give you the last word. So, Josh, you can take as long as you want to close up right now. We will let JF have last word because you had first word, and then if it's unanimous, we can do Q&A. Do you guys both want to do Q&A? If it's just one, or if it's neither, then we're not gonna bother.
Well, I could be there for a short Q&A, but I do have my own show to continue after this, so a short one if possible.
Sure. And what about you, Josh? How are you feeling about Q&A?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I would just answer basic questions about the theory. So
Sure. Okay, so Josh, take as long as you want to close. We'll give JF the last word. We'll do Q&A until you guys are, wanting to move on to the next thing in your life. So yeah, go ahead and close.
Okay, so my opponent hasn't explained how any other theory actually predicted any of the things that the labor theory of value predicts. Now, I gave an opening statement that expressly pointed out each of the predictions that I made sure that I was defending. Now, as to the sociological claim, I'm only claiming that it's a reasonable inference to make. I'm not giving a definite prescription about when and where it will happen, because if I said it would happen in 1950, then obviously that would have disconfirmed the labor theory of value. But the type of inference is the same type of inference that's made by scientists that who think that that eventually there will be no polar ice caps, or that eventually the sun will explode, or that eventually the orbit of the Earth, the orbit of the moon will leave the orbit of the Earth, right? The moon will eventually stop orbiting Earth. It's that kind of inference. Now, that might not be a time-boxed specific inference, and I'm fine with that. But it's a reasonable inference given the tensions that I've outlined, and the fact that the reformations that JF was talking about don't do anything. In fact, the reformations just serve to stave off what could be considered the inevitable, which is just a fallout of the capitalist system, right? Because once a sector starts making more profit, once the sector decides it needs to get more profit or whatever, then they're going to follow these mechanistic tendencies that I'm talking about, which are going to decrease the profit, increase the unemployment, which puts downward pressure on wages, and the cycle, and it does that so it can make super profits, so it can invest in other sectors, and the cycle continues, and it repeats itself. Now, he hasn't said anything that actually disagrees with any of what I've said. Right now, the whole point of his criticism was that he was trying to show how the labor theory of value was false. He did that by pointing to stuff that the theory doesn't attempt to explain, by saying that it's not a theory of non-commodity objects, right? Non-commodity objects don't have a value. That's irrelevant to the theory, right? It's only commodities as understood by the theory. He only pointed out that he actually agreed with everything, all the predictions that I made, saying that they're trivial predictions, but he hasn't substantiated that they're trivial, right? Because they're novel predictions that wouldn't be expected on other theories. And again, he hasn't defended that any other theories actually make those predictions. Those are my closing statements.
All right. Well,
Okay,
since I have the last word,
sure.
I will simply say, think about the twisted mind that you need to adhere to this worldview, where haircutter services charge money, but they have no value, where prostitutes charge money for their blowjob, but the blowjob has no value. And at the end, this idea that a friction between two sets of interests would predict the entire collapse of a society, not realizing, in fact, that people's wealth, even at the bottom of society, keeps increasing. They are not subject to the downward pressure exclusively that is being suggested here. There are clearly upward pressures that make me richer and have more material wealth than most of my ancestors. And this is what Marx forgot to include.
Okay, guys, so for Q&A, let's just do verbal Q&A. If you want to come on mic and ask something, tag me. It's just going to be in order, so, get in there quick. It's in general. If I see any tags of my name that you want to come on, you can come on and ask either debater a question. Okay, so one person wants to come on. That's Jack Angstrike. So I'll just unmute him for a second. And I guess the way we'll do this is if either Josh or JF say they're done with the person, then we just mute them and move to the next. So I'll unmute you now, Angstrike.
Yeah, well, I'm just not understanding. I'm not understanding when JF says that on the theory haircuts have no value, why that's preposterous. Seems like he doesn't understand what value is on the theory, right?
Well, you go ahead and define value for me. What does value mean?
It's not the same thing as price, right? So what is preposterous about saying that they don't have a value when value?
Well, go ahead, define value for me. What definition are you working?
I was using the definition that it has on the labor theory of value.
You go ahead and lay me the definition.
I'm trying to understand. You said.
No, okay. So you want to engage with me on the question of whether a definition is okay, and you refuse to point your own. Fuck you! Fuck you, you little piece of shit! Get out! Ask yourself. I'm done with this.
Okay, so I think that's a no for Angstrike. Now, are there any others who want to come in? I'll give you. Okay, we've got Manny and we've got Insup. Now, I also don't want this all to be one directional. So we'll let Manny on. I'm pretty sure that's going to be another critique for JF. But Insup, if your critique is for Josh, let me know. So yeah, we're just gonna unmute Manny. Give me a second here. Got to find him. Okay, Manny, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask JF why he thinks is an attempt to describe, what he thinks economy, which is the service sector. Why that nevertheless wouldn't have, a lot of meaningful or important implications, right? Like if you take, for example, right, because, what the theory wants to say is the base of the economy, right?
Manny, your mic is just very, very hard to understand. Is there anything you can do about that?
Can you hear me? Is that anything?
No, it's worse, man.
I think I'm lagging. Okay, that's fine. I can.
No. Okay, well, we'll take Insup's question, which is for Josh. But Manny, we can try you again after, take the next few minutes to try to fix your stuff.
I know what he was trying to say. He was trying to ask me, why is it that service...
Okay, sorry, JF, if you're replying to him... Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. Sorry to be rude. If you're replying to him, I am going to just unmute him then. But yeah, go ahead.
All right. So he was trying to ask me, why is it that a theory that wouldn't include service as valuable would not be able to do predictions? My answer is it could do predictions, but I just want to point the meaninglessness of changing the word value semantically that way. When I look at the definition of value on Merriam-Webster, a fair return or equivalent in goods, services, or money for something exchanged. Definitely a part of our economy works on services exchange. In fact, work might be seen, and I do see it that way, as a service. You are exchanging money for time of work. So labor itself is a service. So a theory that seeks to semantically divide and ignore the existence of this as value will have a limited insight into the overall economy, because you'll have mechanisms that are out of the reach of the theory. And if we go back to the original goal of Marx, which was to essentially lead to a physical science of the economy, to predict market movements and to predict the progression of society, you fall short because you can't even predict why people pay $20 to get their hair cut.
But I think pointing to the idea, what Marx meant by value is not something is not what's often meant when people say the word value. I don't think anything turns on that at all, right? Like if I use the phrase big eagle to refer to the United States, say, Trump is the president of the big eagle, right? I would still be correct, right? Just because you don't take the word big eagle to refer to the United States doesn't mean what I'm saying is wrong, right? So if you want to critique the theory, you're going to have to step inside the theory and, and actually engage with the words, right, as they're meant by the theorists themselves, not as they're used by people commonly or how you often use them, right? Because that would just sort of bring up, how it is that you perceive the word as being.
I agree with what you're saying, but we must also call out the deception. When someone comes with a new theory and says, oh, I have explanatory power, in fact, I can predict that society will crash, those are big claims that require something novel. And the problem here is that if you are merely semantically redefining value and saying, actually, the true title of Marx's theory should be Cost Matter, a study on how labor costs do matter to the price of something. The problem is if you frame it that way, no one will say, oh my God, what a grandiose theory. We can predict great stuff with it. The problem is that the labor theory of value does not even explain value. It doesn't even explain most of value in our society. So I think you should.
But that just sounds like you're equivocating again, right? It just sounds like in your final statement, you were just using value not in the sense that Marx meant it. So how could that be a criticism of the value? How could that be a criticism of?
Well, the thing is, if I was to come here and say, look, guys, I have a new theory of physics. It's based on purple pony particles. Everything is a purple pony particles, and some of them are negatively charged, some of them are positively charged. There would be a point at which you would come to me and say, Jeff, there's nothing important about your theory other than you've relabeled electrons and positrons as purple ponies. And that's what I'm calling out here. There is not much important in this theory other than acknowledging that cost exists and they matter in the determination of the offer, which therefore matters in the determination of the value.
I'm just going to put forward a very basic concept of theory of Isaac limited time, right? Which is that the source, right, of all sort of economic life, right, let's say in the economy under the Marxian theory, right, is the commodity or good producing sector, right, the ones that actually create sort of physical products. And the idea is that if that part of the economy were to sort of crash, then the economy as a whole will crash, right, even the sector side of the economy, right? So the point is that under the theory, insofar as there are problems with the commodity producing sector, right? If the theory is correct, it doesn't matter that the service industry is very large, right? Even much larger. Insofar as the theory predicts, the entire economy will come crashing down if the commodity section of the economy has a lot of issues. So merely pointing out that there is like a large service industry doesn't actually imply any problem with the theory. Right? The theory still predicts that that's going to even the larger part of the economy will still run into all these issues and collapse, right? If the sort of the base of the economy, which is commodity, ends up collapsing. Right?
I agree that the collapsing of any physical goods delivery would be terrible for society, including service-based societies. That's why my argument was divided into two distinct points. One, the labor theory of value has limited a domain of applicability that is limited and that doesn't even explain most of value in our society. But secondly, the prediction that it will crash has not been demonstrated. It is based on a fallacy of extrapolation, according to which any friction in a system will eventually lead to a collapse of the system, which it is not. Even physics-based theories will find that friction in a system do not lead to the breaking of the system. It could lead to increase of heat. And there is a sort of increase of heat in the development of capitalist society, which which expresses itself through unions and through negotiation, and in fact through democracy and to the changing of laws of labor. This friction is not necessarily leading to a crash of the system, as you suggest.
Well, I don't think the theory.
Okay, one sec. I think just in the interest of everyone's ears, and I know JF doesn't have the most time in the world, I think we do want to take a selection of questions. So I'm going to keep going, I think, unless JF particularly wants to continue with Manny.
All right, do whatever you feel is good as the host of this.
Well, yeah, I wasn't even expecting Q&A, but yeah, so I'll just keep doing these questions in order, but there will be some prioritization based on who they're for. So we've taken 2 for JF. Let's take one of the questions for Josh. So this is coming in from Insup. Let me just find him here. All right, Insup, you're good to go.